Everyone laughed at the elderly man and his house on wheels. They said he was strange and lived like a vagrant. But when winter came and the city was left without heat, they realized who they shouldn't have ridiculed. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The town had learned long ago how to remain unchanged. Winter ruled it for more months than anyone cared to count, pressing the same routines into every year until habit hardened into character. Snow lay heavy on rooftops and along fences, not as a novelty, but as a constant weight, shaping how people walked, how they spoke, how they judged one another. The houses were built close together, practical and square, their paint faded by decades of cold wind. From a distance, the town looked orderly and calm, but beneath that stillness lived a quiet vigilance, an unspoken agreement about who belonged and who did not. People here valued predictability. A man was known by his job, a woman by her family, a neighbor by how long they had lived on the same street. Anyone who fit those expectations passed unnoticed, accepted without thought. Anyone who did not was discussed, measured, reduced. Difference did not inspire curiosity. It inspired commentary. Sometimes it took the form of jokes, sometimes of silence, but it always served the same purpose: to remind everyone else where the edges of acceptance lay. Mornings began the same way. Doors opened in unison, boots crunched over packed snow, engines coughed themselves awake. At the small grocery store near the main road, people lingered longer than necessary, exchanging news that was rarely new. Who was late on their mortgage? Whose son might be leaving town? Which winter was worse than the last? The town survived on repetition, and repetition rewarded those who did not challenge it. It was into this landscape that Eli Brooks appeared. He did not arrive with announcement or explanation. There was no moment anyone could later point to and say, that was when he came. He simply began to be seen. At first it was from a distance, a figure moving slowly along the outer road that skirted the edge of the forest. Then people noticed the shape behind him, the odd silhouette that did not belong to any vehicle they recognized. Over time, curiosity sharpened into recognition, and recognition into ridicule. Eli was old, though not frail. His body carried the compact strength of a man who had worked with his hands for most of his life. His back was slightly bent, but his steps were steady. He dressed simply, in layers worn thin but carefully mended. His gloves were patched, his boots scarred, but nothing about him was careless. He moved with intention, conserving energy, as if every step had already been calculated. Behind him rolled the house. It was small, no larger than a single room, built entirely of wood. The boards were mismatched, their colors dulled by years of exposure. The roof slanted unevenly, reinforced with metal strips that caught the pale winter light. There was only one window, narrow and thickly framed, set into the side like an afterthought. The wheels beneath it did not match, one painted in faded red and blue, the other stripped down to bare metal. The whole structure looked heavy, impractical, and out of place against the smooth lines of modern houses and parked cars. People stopped and stared. At first they laughed quietly, unsure whether what they were seeing was real. A house on wheels was not unheard of, but this was no trailer, no manufactured shelter hauled by a truck. This was something else entirely, something built by hand, something that should not have been able to move at all. Eli pulled it alone. The sight unsettled the town more than anyone admitted. It was easier to turn discomfort into humor. Someone at the grocery store called it a shed that had lost its way. Someone else said the old man must have mistaken a house for a wheelbarrow. Laughter spread easily, because it always did. It cost nothing, and it reinforced the quiet confidence of those who stood warm and stationary, watching from the side. No one asked Eli where he was going. No one asked why he needed a house that could move. Those questions required an openness the town had long since forgotten. It was enough to watch him struggle and to feel reassured that whatever his reasons were, they placed him firmly outside the circle of normalcy. Eli did not look at them. He kept his eyes on the ground ahead, scanning for patches of ice, measuring the resistance of the snow beneath the wheels. His hands gripped the wooden handles he had built into the front of the house, his shoulders leaning forward at a precise angle. When the road dipped or the snow deepened, he adjusted his stance without hesitation, shifting weight, correcting balance. There was nothing reckless in his movement, nothing desperate. It was the controlled effort of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. One afternoon, as the sky darkened early and the cold sharpened into something more aggressive, the wheels caught in a drift near the edge of town. Eli pulled, paused, then pulled again. The house did not move. A gust of wind rattled the loose boards, sending a hollow sound through the quiet street. People gathered at a distance, drawn by the interruption. Someone leaned against a fence, arms crossed. Someone else slowed their car, watching through the windshield. A few laughed openly now, emboldened by the stillness of the moment. Eli tried once more. The wheel sank deeper, the snow compacting beneath it. His boot slipped, and for a brief moment his balance gave way. He fell to one knee, one hand bracing against the frozen ground. The laughter grew louder. It was not cruel in the way shouted insults were cruel. It was softer, almost casual, which made it worse. This was the laughter of people who felt no responsibility for what they were witnessing. The laughter of those who believed that if a man struggled publicly, it must somehow be his own fault. Eli remained still for a moment, his breath visible in the air. He did not curse. He did not look up. Slowly, he pushed himself back to his feet, brushing snow from his knee. He adjusted the angle of the handles, wedged a small wooden block beneath the wheel, and tried again. This time, the house shifted, just enough to break free. No one clapped. No one stepped forward to help. Assistance would have required engagement, and engagement would have meant acknowledging that the old man and his strange house were not merely a spectacle, but something real. Eli continued on. As he moved away from the town, the buildings thinned and the road narrowed. Trees rose higher, their bare branches creaking softly under the weight of snow. Here, beyond the reach of streetlights and sidewalks, the world felt older, less concerned with appearances. Eli's pace slowed, but his posture remained the same, steady and deliberate. Inside him, there was no anger at the laughter. That emotion had burned out long ago, replaced by something quieter and more durable. He had learned, through years of being overlooked and dismissed, that responding only gave others power they did not deserve. Silence, for him, was not surrender. It was control. He was aware of how he looked to them, an old black man, alone, pulling a wooden house through snow like some relic of a forgotten time. He knew the stories they told themselves, the assumptions they made without ever speaking them aloud. He had lived long enough to recognize the pattern. It did not surprise him anymore. What surprised them was that he did not stop. Even as the wind picked up and the path grew more difficult, Eli pressed on, guiding the house toward the tree line. The forest waited ahead, dark and patient, offering neither comfort nor judgment. To the town behind him, the sight of his retreat confirmed what they already believed. He was leaving because he did not belong. He was disappearing because he could not keep up. They did not consider that he might be choosing exactly where to go. As dusk settled, the house and the man pulling it became little more than shapes against the snow. The laughter faded, replaced by the familiar sounds of doors closing and heaters clicking on. The town returned to itself, satisfied that the interruption had passed. Eli did not look back. The house creaked softly as it rolled deeper into the forest, its weight steady behind him. Snow began to fall again, thick and relentless, erasing footprints almost as soon as they were made. By the time darkness fully arrived, there was no sign left of the man or the path he had taken. Only the cold remained, settling in, patient and unforgiving, as winter prepared to show the town what it truly meant to endure. Night settled over the forest, with a patience the town had long forgotten. Here, beyond the reach of streetlights and plowed roads, darkness did not arrive all at once. It thickened gradually, folding itself between the trees, softening outlines, muting sound. Snow fell steadily, not in hurried bursts, but in a slow, persistent descent that erased sharp edges and demanded attention from anything that moved within it. Eli guided the house into a small clearing he had chosen long before. The ground dipped slightly there, shielded from the worst of the wind by a natural rise and a cluster of old pines whose roots clawed deep into frozen earth. He stopped only when the wheels rested exactly where he wanted them, aligned with a subtle slope that most eyes would have missed. The house stood still, balanced, as if it had finally exhaled. Inside, warmth already lingered. Eli stepped through the narrow door and closed it behind him, sealing the interior from the cold that pressed eagerly at the wooden walls. The space was modest, but it did not feel cramped. Everything inside had been placed with intention. There was a small stove set into one corner, surrounded by carefully layered stone and metal that absorbed and released heat slowly. Shelves lined the walls, their contents sparse but orderly. Tools hung in precise rows, each one worn smooth by years of use. There was a narrow bed built into the far wall, raised slightly off the floor, with storage beneath it. No decoration, no clutter. Nothing unnecessary. The temperature inside was steady, neither stifling nor cold. Eli removed his gloves and set them on a hook near the door, then rested his hands briefly against the wooden wall, feeling the faint, even warmth beneath his palms. The house responded to touch the way something alive might, holding heat where it was needed, conserving it where it was not. He moved through his evening routine without haste. A piece of wood was added to the stove at the right moment, not when the fire demanded it, but when the structure required it. He adjusted a vent near the floor, then another closer to the ceiling, guiding the flow of air with small, precise movements. Each action was measured, practiced, the result of years of refinement rather than instinct alone. This house had not been built quickly. Eli sat at the small table fixed to the wall and opened a notebook whose cover had softened with age. The pages inside were filled with handwriting that shifted subtly over time, growing tighter, more deliberate. There were sketches there, diagrams drawn and redrawn, notes in the margins that referenced earlier pages, measurements, observations, corrections. It was not a journal in the traditional sense. It was a record of thinking. He turned to a page marked by a folded corner and scanned the lines, then made a small notation beside one of them. Outside, the wind rose, testing the walls. Inside, the temperature barely changed. Years earlier, when the idea had first taken shape in his mind, Eli had not imagined this ending. He had not pictured himself alone in the forest, refining a single structure while the rest of the world moved on without him. Back then, the work had been larger, louder, filled with voices and meetings and promises that seemed solid at the time. He had been younger, his hands steadier, his optimism less guarded. He remembered the rooms where those early conversations took place, long tables cluttered with papers, screens filled with projections of designs and budgets. The idea had been simple in its essence: mobility without fragility, shelter that could adapt rather than resist, structures that respected the environment they occupied instead of fighting it. The first models had failed. The second ones failed differently. Each failure had taught him something, and he had learned eagerly, adjusting calculations, changing materials, arguing for patience when others demanded speed. He had believed that good work, if given time, would justify itself. What he had underestimated was how quickly patience could be exhausted when profit entered the conversation. The project had been labeled impractical, then inefficient, then unnecessary. Each new term distanced the decision-makers further from the reality of what they were abandoning. When funding was cut, the announcement had been delivered with professional regret, as if that regret absolved them of responsibility. Eli had listened without speaking, absorbing the words as he always did, already aware that argument would change nothing. The consequences had not ended there. What followed was quieter but more destructive. Contracts dissolved. Recommendations disappeared. The doors he had assumed would always open no longer did. The work he had poured himself into became a liability rather than an achievement, its association marking him as someone who did not fit neatly into the next initiative or the one after that. There had been personal loss as well, tangled inseparably with the professional. The strain of uncertainty, the erosion of stability, the slow realization that promises would not be kept. Eli did not dwell on those memories now, but they lived in him all the same, informing every decision he made, every compromise he refused to accept. When he left that life behind, it was not in anger. It was in recognition. The house had begun as an experiment, a proof of concept built from what he could afford and what others discarded. Old lumber reclaimed and reinforced. Insulation layered from materials no one thought worth saving. Wheels salvaged and adapted, their imperfections compensated for through balance rather than replacement. Each limitation forced innovation. Each mistake improved the next iteration. Over time, the structure had become more than a test. It had become an answer. Eli rose from the table and crossed to the window, peering out into the night. Snow piled against the lower walls, drifting in patterns that told him which direction the wind favored. He made another small adjustment near the base of the door, sealing a gap that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. The house responded, as it always did. He prepared a simple meal, the steam rising briefly before being drawn away through a narrow vent he had designed to prevent condensation. Even the scent of food did not linger long, carried out in a controlled exchange of air that kept the interior dry and stable. Every detail served a purpose, each one learned through trial rather than theory alone. As he ate, his thoughts returned briefly to the town. He pictured their neat houses and dependable systems, their confidence in things that had never been tested beyond the limits of comfort. He did not resent them for their laughter. He understood it too well. People trusted what they recognized and mocked what they could not immediately categorize. What they could not see was the difference between improvised survival and deliberate design. When he finished, Eli cleaned his dishes and returned them to their place. He checked the stove once more, then extinguished the lamp. Darkness filled the house, but it was not complete. The faint glow of embers and the soft reflection of snowlight through the window provided just enough illumination. He lay down on the bed, listening. The wind howled through the trees, rattling branches, driving snow hard against the outer walls. The house shifted slightly, absorbing the force, redistributing it through joints that had been strengthened and tested over countless nights like this one. The sound was not alarming. It was familiar, reassuring in its predictability. Eli closed his eyes, not to escape the storm, but to feel it. He sensed the pressure changes, the subtle vibrations, the way the structure responded. Somewhere deep in his mind, calculations ran quietly, confirming what he already knew. The house was ready. Beyond the clearing, the forest bore the full weight of the storm. Branches cracked under ice, paths vanished beneath fresh snow. The town, miles away, slept under the illusion of security, unaware of how fragile that security truly was. Eli did not sleep deeply. He never did during the first night of a heavy storm. His rest came in intervals, each one light enough that he could wake at the smallest change. It was not fear that kept him alert. It was responsibility. This house was not an accident. It was not a symbol of poverty or stubbornness, as the town believed. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent learning how systems failed and how they could be made to endure. It was a refusal to accept that comfort and safety belonged only to those who fit within someone else's definition of success. As the storm strengthened and the temperature dropped, Eli remained calm, his breathing steady. The walls held. The heat remained. The design proved itself once again, silently and without witnesses. Outside, winter tightened its grip, moving inexorably toward the town that had laughed and turned away. Inside the house, a man lay awake, prepared not only to survive what was coming, but to endure it on his own terms. And as the night wore on, the distance between those two realities began to close. Morning did not truly arrive in the forest. It merely shifted the color of darkness, turning it from absolute black into a dense, colorless gray that seemed to press downward rather than lift. Snow continued to fall, not in dramatic sheets, but in a steady, methodical descent that carried no urgency because it did not need any. It knew it had time. Eli rose before the light changed, as he always did when the pressure in the air shifted the way it had during the night. He moved quietly, careful not to waste heat or motion, and checked the small indicators he trusted more than any forecast. The metal strip near the vent was colder than it had been hours earlier. The wood along the outer wall held a tension he recognized. Outside, the storm had not peaked. It was still gathering itself. He added a measured amount of fuel to the stove and waited until the temperature stabilized before closing the vent again. There was no satisfaction in being right about the weather. Only preparation. Beyond the trees, the town was waking to its own version of morning. People noticed the cold first in small ways. The air stung more sharply when they stepped outside. The snow underfoot felt denser, resistant in a way that hinted at deeper accumulation. Engines took longer to turn over. Windows fogged more quickly. Still, no one was alarmed. Winter always arrived with drama, and this felt no different from what they had known before. Forecasts had mentioned an extended cold front days earlier, but forecasts were treated as background noise, something to acknowledge and then dismiss. The town had weathered bad winters before. It had furnaces, power lines, supply trucks that came on schedule. Confidence was built into its foundations as firmly as the pipes that ran beneath the streets. By midday, the first disruptions appeared. A delivery truck failed to arrive. The driver radioed in that the road had narrowed unexpectedly, drifts piling higher than plows could manage. Repairs to a transformer on the northern edge of town took longer than expected, the cold slowing hands and stiffening equipment. None of it was catastrophic. Not yet. But irritation replaced ease, and irritation, when layered with cold, had a way of turning sharp. Eli observed none of this directly. From his clearing, the town was an abstraction, a presence defined more by memory than sight. What he did notice were the subtle changes in the storm's rhythm. Wind shifted directions more frequently. Snow began to fall finer, almost powdery, an indication of dropping temperatures. The forest responded with sound, branches creaking, trunks groaning under uneven loads. He spent part of the afternoon reinforcing a section near the base of the house, adding a brace he had prepared weeks earlier, but not yet needed. His movements were unhurried, his attention focused inward. Preparation was not a reaction for him. It was a state of being. As the day wore on, the town's confidence began to thin. Power flickered in several neighborhoods, returning quickly enough to be dismissed, but often enough to unsettle. By evening, the grocery store shelves looked different, gaps appearing where staples had once been abundant. People joked about it. But the jokes carried an edge. The cold outside deepened, seeping into walls that had never been asked to withstand it for long. That night, the wind rose to a pitch the town had not heard in years. It screamed through streets and around corners, forcing its way into places it had been kept out of before. Snow drifted against doors and garages, blocking some completely. Inside, heaters worked harder, cycling on and off in quick succession. Then, shortly before midnight, the power went out. At first, people waited. Power always came back. They wrapped themselves in blankets, lit candles, checked their phones. But the minutes stretched, and the darkness remained. Outside, the wind drowned out any distant sound of repair crews. Inside, homes grew quieter, colder. In the forest, Eli felt the absence of power like a distant echo. The storm did not change for him. The house continued to hold its warmth, the internal temperature barely shifting despite the falling mercury outside. He listened, attentive but calm, aware that the storm was entering a new phase. By morning, the town awoke to a silence more unsettling than noise. The wind had not stopped, but it had steadied, settling into a relentless, grinding force. Snow lay thick against buildings, sculpted into hard shapes by cold air. Streets were unrecognizable. The power remained out. People ventured outside cautiously, calling to neighbors, assessing damage. Pipes froze in houses that relied too heavily on electric heating. Some furnaces failed outright. Phones stopped working as batteries drained. Attempts to reach emergency services met with busy signals or nothing at all. It was then that fear began to take shape. Not panic yet. Panic required immediacy. This was something slower, more insidious. The realization that systems assumed to be permanent were fragile, and that the cold did not care about expectations. Someone remembered the old man. At first it was said lightly, almost as a joke offered to relieve tension. Someone mentioned having seen smoke near the tree line the night before. Someone else recalled the strange house on wheels, the one that had been pulled out of town just days earlier. Laughter followed, but it was thinner now. Forced. As the day dragged on and the temperature dropped further, the idea returned, uninvited, but persistent. The laughter faded. People began to ask questions they had not considered before. How had that house stayed warm without being connected to anything? How had the old man known where to go before the storm arrived? Eli spent the day inside, making minor adjustments as the external temperature fell to levels that would have cracked poorly designed structures. He checked the walls, the joints, the vents. Everything performed as intended. The house responded not by resisting the cold, but by working with it, minimizing loss, distributing pressure. He thought of the town only briefly, not with judgment, but with recognition. He had seen this pattern before. Confidence eroded not in moments of disaster, but in hours of waiting, when people realized help might not arrive quickly. As night fell again, the cold intensified. Inside the town, several families huddled together, abandoning larger houses for smaller spaces that were easier to warm. Arguments broke out over fuel, over blankets, over decisions that should have been made sooner. Fear sharpened voices and shortened tempers. By contrast, the forest remained indifferent. The storm continued its work, methodical and precise. Late that night, a figure stood at the edge of town, staring toward the dark line of trees. He was not laughing now. His hands were shoved deep into his coat, his breath ragged in the cold air. He remembered the sight of Eli pulling the house through snow, remembered the ease with which the old man had moved, as if he understood something everyone else did not. The idea he had dismissed now returned with weight. In the forest, Eli sat at his table, writing by the steady glow of the lamp. Outside, the temperature dropped another degree. Inside, the house held firm. He paused, listening, not to the storm, but to the quiet beneath it. The distance between preparation and need was closing. The storm reached its full voice sometime before dawn, not with a sudden escalation, but with a quiet certainty that settled into the bones. The wind no longer gusted in bursts. It pressed continuously, a sustained force that bent trees and drove snow sideways with relentless discipline. The cold sharpened beyond anything the town's measurements had predicted, slipping past thresholds people had assumed would never be crossed. In the forest, Eli felt the shift immediately. It was not a matter of sound or sight, but pressure, a subtle tightening in the air that signaled the storm had stopped testing and begun asserting itself. He rose from his bed and moved through the house, touching walls, checking joints, listening to the low, steady responses of materials under stress. Everything remained within tolerances he knew well. The house did not groan or shudder. It absorbed. Miles away, absorption was no longer an option. In the town, the night had been long and restless. Without power, darkness felt heavier, pressing into rooms and corridors. Candles burned low, their flames trembling with every draft. People layered clothing and blankets, trying to trap warmth that leaked steadily from walls never designed for this kind of cold. The silence between bursts of wind became oppressive, filled with the sound of breathing, of teeth chattering, of furnaces that would not restart. By morning, several homes had become unlivable. Water lines froze and burst, flooding floors that quickly turned to ice. Heaters failed under the strain, their mechanisms locked by cold they were never meant to endure. Attempts to burn improvised fuel-filled rooms with smoke, forcing families to choose between freezing and suffocating. Panic crept in quietly, its presence marked not by screams, but by hurried decisions and rising voices. Neighbors moved between houses, checking on one another, carrying children wrapped in blankets, sharing what little fuel remained. The social order that had once been defined by routine began to dissolve, replaced by a more primitive calculus. Who had heat? Who had space? Who could endure another hour? It was during these movements that the old joke stopped. Someone mentioned the forest again, not with humor this time, but with hesitation. They spoke of the man with the house on wheels, of how he had left before the storm arrived, of how his shelter had not depended on any grid or delivery. The idea hung in the air, uncomfortable and unwelcome, because it demanded a reversal no one was ready to make. To ask for help from the person they had mocked was to acknowledge that the laughter had been misplaced. By midday, the situation worsened. The temperature dropped another degree. Emergency services, already strained, could no longer reach certain areas. Snowdrifts blocked roads completely. The town, so confident in its permanence, felt suddenly fragile, exposed. In one house near the edge of town, a man sat in the dim light of a single candle, staring at the wall without seeing it. He had been among the loudest voices when the old man passed through, quick with jokes, quicker with dismissive smiles. Now his hands shook, not only from cold, but from something heavier. He thought of the way Eli had fallen in the snow and risen again without complaint. He thought of the ease with which the house had rolled once freed, as if it belonged to the storm rather than resisting it. He stood abruptly, decision hardening in his chest. The journey to the forest was not short, and it was not easy. Snow reached his knees in places, forcing him to lift his legs high with each step. The wind battered him from the side, threatening to knock him off balance. More than once, he considered turning back, telling himself it was foolish, that no shelter could withstand this cold. But each time he paused, the memory of the frozen rooms behind him pushed him forward. As he moved farther from the town, the noise diminished. The wind still howled, but the buildings that had amplified it were gone. The forest absorbed sound differently, its vastness offering no echoes, only depth. Snow hung in the air, blurring distances and disguising landmarks. When he finally saw the house, it did not appear suddenly. It emerged gradually from the gray, its outline becoming clearer with each step. The small wooden structure stood firm in the clearing, snow piled high around its base, but not overtaking it. There was no sign of panic, no frantic activity. The house simply existed, steady and unmoved. Light glowed faintly through the single window. The man stopped several paces away, his breath ragged, his chest tight with exhaustion and shame. For a long moment he stood there, uncertain how to proceed. Pride urged him to turn back. Necessity held him in place. He knocked. The sound seemed small against the storm, barely audible even to his own ears. He knocked again, harder this time, then waited, his hands numb, his heart pounding. The door opened. Eli stood framed in the doorway, his face calm, his posture relaxed. He looked at the man without surprise, as if he had been expecting this moment, though there was no satisfaction in his expression, only recognition. The man tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. What apology could cover days, weeks, years of dismissal? What explanation could justify laughter in the face of what now felt like wisdom? Eli stepped aside. The gesture was simple, unremarkable, and in its simplicity lay its power. He did not demand an apology. He did not ask for an explanation. He made space. The man crossed the threshold, and the change was immediate. Warmth enveloped him, not in a blast, but in a steady presence that seemed to wrap itself around his body. The air inside was clean and dry, free of smoke and dampness. The walls radiated a gentle heat that seeped into his clothes and skin. He exhaled, a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh. Soon, others followed. Word traveled quickly now, urgency replacing pride. One by one, people made the difficult walk to the clearing, each carrying their own burden of fear and regret. Eli received them all the same way, opening the door, stepping aside, allowing entry without comment. Inside the house, space was limited, but it was enough. People sat close together, sharing blankets, sharing silence. They spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb the balance that kept them alive. Every surface seemed purposeful, every detail intentional. The house did not feel improvised. It felt resolved. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to human struggle. Inside, laughter had no place. It had frozen somewhere back in the town, rendered useless by cold and consequence. Eli moved among them quietly, adjusting vents, adding fuel at measured intervals. He did not lecture, he did not explain. His actions spoke with the authority of experience, and the people who watched him understood, perhaps for the first time, what they had failed to see. By nightfall, the house held more than warmth. It held a reckoning. The storm showed no sign of relenting, but something else had shifted. The distance between mockery and respect had collapsed, compressed by necessity into a narrow space where truth could no longer be ignored. And in that space, as the wind battered the walls and the house endured, the town's laughter finally fell silent. The house was never truly silent, but the sounds it made were unlike those of any shelter the people inside had known before. There was no rattling of loose walls, no sharp cracks of stressed beams, no hiss of desperate heat escaping through unseen gaps. Instead, there was a low, steady presence, a muted conversation between wood, metal, and air that spoke of balance rather than struggle. For those who had entered in fear, this quiet order felt almost unreal. They sat close together, not because Eli instructed them to, but because the space itself encouraged a different understanding of proximity. Here, closeness wasn't intrusion. It was necessity shaped into cooperation, Blankets were passed without comment. Someone shifted to make room for another without being asked. Children, exhausted by cold and confusion, slept quickly, their breathing soft and even, as if the house itself had decided to protect them first. Time lost its familiar shape. Hours passed without the markers people were used to. There were no clocks humming on walls, no phones lighting up with notifications. Outside, the storm erased any sense of day or night. Inside, existence narrowed to the essentials: warmth, breath, stillness. In that narrowing, something else began to surface. At first, no one spoke about the past. Words felt heavy, dangerous, as if a careless sentence might upset the delicate equilibrium that held them all together. They watched Eli instead, observing how he moved through the space with quiet assurance. He adjusted vents with a practiced hand, added fuel to the stove only when the internal temperature required it, never sooner. He checked the walls by touch alone, as though reading information invisible to everyone else. Someone noticed the notebooks stacked neatly on a shelf and asked, softly, what they were. Eli hesitated before answering, not because he guarded the truth, but because he was unused to being asked with genuine interest. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, carrying no resentment. "Records," he said. "Observations." The words seemed insufficient, but no one pressed him yet. As the storm continued to batter the forest, people began to talk among themselves in low voices. Stories surfaced, fragmented and unremarkable on their own. How they had laughed when they first saw the house. How they had shaken their heads, secure in the belief that whatever that old man was doing, it had nothing to do with them. Now those memories carried weight. Each recollection was an acknowledgement, quiet but unmistakable, of how easily judgment had replaced curiosity. Later, when the fire burned low and Eli replenished it, someone finally asked the question that had been circling the room since the first person crossed the threshold. "How did you know?" Eli did not ask what they meant. He understood. He sat at the small table and opened one of the notebooks, turning the pages slowly, as if reacquainting himself with thoughts long recorded. He did not launch into explanation. Instead, he spoke in fragments, offering pieces rather than a full account, trusting that those who listened would assemble the truth themselves. He spoke of work he had once done, not with pride, but with clarity. Of structures designed to move where others could not. Of shelters meant for extremes rather than averages. He described rooms filled with people who believed innovation could be measured only by immediate return, and how that belief had narrowed every conversation until the work itself no longer fit. As he spoke, the house seemed to listen with them, the warmth holding steady, the walls unmoved by the storm's violence. The contrast was not lost on anyone present. Someone asked why he had never tried to explain himself to the town, why he had accepted their laughter and silence without protest. Eli closed the notebook. "Because explanation only matters to people who want to understand," he said. "The rest just want reassurance that they're right." No one argued. The truth settled heavily among them. It was not an accusation, but it felt like one all the same. The people sitting there began to see their own reflections in his words. How often had they dismissed what did not fit their expectations? How often had they trusted familiarity over substance? As the hours passed, Eli spoke more freely, not because he felt compelled, but because the need for secrecy no longer served him. He talked about the project that had ended, about the way funding vanished quietly, about how responsibility dissolved into paperwork and polite regret. He did not name individuals. He did not describe confrontations. His story was one of erosion rather than explosion, of being slowly pushed to the margins until leaving felt like the only honest choice. Someone asked about the house itself, about how it could withstand what entire neighborhoods could not. Eli smiled faintly, the expression brief but genuine. "It doesn't fight the cold," he said. "It understands it." He explained how heat was not forced, but guided, how materials were chosen not for appearance, but for behavior under stress. How mobility was not about escape, but about adaptability. Each explanation stripped away another assumption the listeners had carried unknowingly. In those moments, the people inside the house realized something more painful than their fear. They realized they had laughed not at ignorance, but at foresight. They had mistaken humility for weakness and difference for failure. Guilt surfaced quietly. No one apologized out loud. Words felt insufficient. Instead, remorse showed itself in attention, in listening without interruption, in the way eyes followed Eli's movements with something close to reverence. Later, as the storm began to lose some of its fury, someone suggested that Eli should return to the town once this was over, that his work should be seen, shared, perhaps even rebuilt on a larger scale. There was talk of recognition, of funding, of restoring what had been taken from him. Eli listened without responding. The offer hung in the air, heavy with good intentions and unexamined assumptions. It assumed that validation was what he wanted. That acknowledgement could undo what had already been lived. When he finally spoke, his words were careful. "I didn't build this to be seen," he said. "I built it to last." The storm outside eased slightly, its roar softening into a persistent wind. Inside, the house remained unchanged, steady as it had been from the beginning. The people gathered there understood then that what they were being offered was not merely shelter from cold, but shelter from the illusions they had lived with for years. As the night wore on, exhaustion claimed them one by one. They slept where they could, leaning against walls, against one another, breathing in unison. Eli remained awake longer, seated at the table, writing by the dim light of the lamp. His notes were brief this time, fewer observations, more confirmations. The truth had been spoken, not all at once, but enough. Outside, the storm began to loosen its grip, though no one inside knew it yet. Inside the house, something irreversible had already occurred. The distance between the man they had mocked and the knowledge he carried had vanished, replaced by a respect, born not of admiration, but of understanding. By the time dawn approached, the house held more than bodies seeking warmth. It held the weight of recognition and the quiet certainty that some truths reveal themselves only when there is no other choice left. The storm did not end with drama. It loosened its grip the way it had taken hold, gradually and without ceremony. By the time the first pale light filtered through the forest canopy, the wind had softened into a low, restless breath, and the snow fell no longer in dense sheets, but in scattered, hesitant flakes, as though winter itself were reconsidering its resolve. Inside the house, people stirred slowly. Sleep had come to them in fragments, shaped by exhaustion rather than comfort. Yet it had been enough. Children woke first, confused but warm, their faces no longer tight with fear. Adults followed, stretching stiff limbs, listening carefully to the unfamiliar quiet. For the first time in days, the absence of violence in the air felt louder than the storm ever had. Eli rose before anyone else fully gathered themselves. Habit guided him, as it always had. He checked the stove, adjusted the vents, and placed his hand briefly against the wall, confirming what he already knew. The house had done what it was built to do. It had endured. One by one, the people stepped outside. The forest looked altered, as though it had aged overnight. Snow lay deep and undisturbed, smoothing over fallen branches and reshaping the ground into something both beautiful and treacherous. The clearing bore the marks of survival rather than struggle. The house stood exactly where it had before, its shape unchanged, its presence calm. From the edge of the trees, the town was barely visible, a suggestion of structures rather than a place of certainty. Smoke rose from a few chimneys now, thin and tentative, signs that power had begun to return in some areas. The crisis was easing, but it had not passed without leaving its mark. People exchanged glances, then words. Quiet plans formed. Who would check on which neighbor? Who would try to clear which road? Who needed help first? The tone was different now, stripped of the easy confidence that had defined them before. Survival had rearranged priorities, exposing how fragile the old ones had been. Several turned toward Eli, gratitude clear in their expressions. Some attempted to thank him aloud, their voices thick with emotion. Others hesitated, unsure how to speak to a man they were only now beginning to understand. Eli listened, nodding when necessary, but he did not linger on their words. He had never done his work for praise, and he would not begin now. When someone mentioned again the idea of returning to the town together, of making sure his house and his knowledge were no longer ignored, he did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked around the house, checking the wheels, brushing away accumulated snow, testing the ground beneath each support. The movements were familiar, comforting in their certainty. The house, like him, was built for motion, not for settling into a place that demanded explanation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no bitterness. "You should go," he said. "People will need you." They understood then that the statement was not a dismissal, but a boundary. One by one, they prepared to leave. Blankets were returned, tools set back in their places. Children looked back at the house with curiosity and a trace of reluctance, as though leaving meant stepping away from something safer than anything they had known before. At the edge of the clearing, a man who had once laughed openly at the sight of Eli pulling the house through snow stopped and turned. "I was wrong," he said simply. Eli met his gaze and inclined his head. The acknowledgement was enough. It did not erase the past, but it did not need to. Recognition had arrived, and with it, the quiet dignity of closure. As the group disappeared into the trees, their figures shrinking against the vastness of the forest, the clearing returned to stillness. Eli stood alone again, though the solitude no longer felt imposed. It was chosen, reaffirmed by what had passed. He began preparing the house for movement. The snow was deep, heavier than before, but the path he intended to take had already been decided. He adjusted the front handles, tested the wheels, and took a moment to look toward the town. From here, it appeared smaller than it ever had, its permanence revealed as an illusion shaped by convenience rather than truth. He did not feel anger toward it. The town had shown him what it was capable of, both in its cruelty and its humility. That knowledge did not demand his presence. With a steady pull, he set the house in motion. The wheels protested briefly, then turned, cutting a clean line through the snow. Eli leaned into the effort, his body settling into a rhythm honed by years of similar journeys. Each step carried him farther from the clearing, deeper into the forest, toward terrain less forgiving, but more honest. Behind him, the tracks formed a narrow path that would soon be covered by fresh snowfall, erased as thoroughly as the laughter that had once followed him. Ahead, the forest opened gradually, revealing slopes and valleys shaped by forces older than any town. As he moved, Eli thought not of what he had lost, but of what had been proven. His work had not failed. It had simply waited for the moment when its value could no longer be denied. That moment had come and gone, leaving behind something quieter than recognition. Purpose. The house rolled on, its walls steady, its balance precise. It did not belong to the forest, nor to the town. It belonged to the space between certainty and adaptation, where survival was not granted by systems or approval, but earned through understanding. By the time the sun climbed higher, its light catching on the snow and scattering into sharp brilliance, Eli and the house were already far from the clearing. The forest closed behind them, swallowing sound and trace alike. What remained in the town was not a monument or a lesson carved into stone, but something more difficult to ignore. A memory of warmth that had come from an unexpected place, a recognition that wisdom did not always arrive in familiar forms, and the understanding that dignity, once revealed, did not need to announce itself to continue forward. The house continued its journey, and so did the man who had built it, moving not away from the world, but beyond the need to be seen by it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Watch the following videos to continue this journey and discover other stories like this one. If this story mattered to you, share it with someone who should see it.